is the country director for Innovations for Poverty Action, or IPA Philippines, and chief manager of IPA's diverse portfolio of evaluations and research. She holds a doctorate degree in public administration from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, has an MA in development studies from the University of Manchester, a master's in international studies, and a BA in political science from the University of the Philippines as well. She was named one of Manila's 40 under 40 international development leaders by DevEx in 2013, and UK Education Ambassador for the Philippines by the British Embassy in 2015. So it is with great honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Nash Baddiri. You may take the floor.
Thank you, Lee.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting us. We're very happy to present today. I know medyo time constrained, but hopefully we'll be able to go through the slides that we have for everyone. Yeah, so maybe I should start sharing. Let me see. I think I need to do the slideshow. Okay, so I'm wondering if it's showing up, Leah, in your side. Okay, sounds great. Yeah, so yeah, good afternoon, everyone. As I mentioned earlier, we're very happy to be here. I'm with my colleague, Yuna Liang, our research coordinator, as well as Innovations for Poverty Action. And we're here today to share some evidence on financial inclusion, specifically on financial education, digital finance, and remittances. So we'll give you just a brief introduction of IPA. I'm not so sure if most of you have heard of us yet. And then we'll have a Q&A, and then maybe later, I think Yuna will also speak about our studies in remittances. Okay. So about IPA, in a nutshell, what we do is that we conduct rigorous research using randomized controlled trials to promote evidence-based policies. And the reason why we want evidence-based policies, as most of you are already aware, is because we want cost-effective programs, especially programs that are proven to reduce poverty. Our vision is that if we have more evidence of what works, that can contribute to less poverty. But we've seen so far, in many fields, especially in development, that there's little evidence or little investment in discovering what works. So for-profit firms, for example, you see a lot of R&D investments, but in development, we see a very small proportion of funds going to research and development, or trying to figure out innovations and testing those innovations. And so the solution, as we see it, is that it's really looking at limited evidence. So because we see that we don't have a lot of evidence on what works to help the poor, and of the limited evidence that we have, there's also limited use. It could be various reasons. Maybe the evidence that we have is very technical. It's not really as relevant to policymakers or decision makers. And so that results to ineffective programs and policies and wasted resources. The solution is really very simple, which is also sort of our theory of change, as an organization, is to design and evaluate potential solutions to poverty problems in different sectors, mobilize support of decision makers to use evidence. So we work very closely with policymakers in the Philippines to use evidence. And that would result to better programs and policies. And ultimately, if you have more evidence, then that contributes to less poverty. IPA works with different stakeholders as well. We work very closely with academics in many universities around the world. In the Philippines, we work with various government agencies. We've completed projects with the DOLE, DSWD, DAR. We're working with the Supreme Court, the Department of Education. We also work with implementing partners and service providers, local nonprofits and businesses. And we also partner closely with our funders, from many of which are very much interested in identifying innovations in the development sector. Our approach is quite simple. We work with decision makers and policymakers to identify problems, especially related to poverty. We work closely to design using frontier knowledge in psychology, economics, political science, and to design and identify solutions in these sectors. We evaluate these solutions using rigorous methodology. And once we have proof of concept, we promote the scale-up of effective ideas. And all throughout this process, we champion the use of evidence to make sure that that evidence is being used every step of the way. We have about 750 ongoing and completed studies around the world in different areas such as agriculture. We work with DAR in the Philippines in education. We have a 5-year partnership with the DepEd in financial inclusion. We're also working with the Bangko Sentral of the Philippines, as well as governance, health, peace and recovery, SMEs, and social protection. So in this slide, you can see that I've highlighted 3 important researchers who work in JPAL and IPA's network. So they recently won the Nobel Prize in Economics, specifically, for the experimental approach that they're using to alleviate global poverty. And this experimental approach is what we call the randomized controlled trials. And I think this is quite important because, it gives us really, an idea of how to move forward given the many questions that we have in terms of a lot of the development, programs that are being implemented. One example that I've cited here is microcredit, right? And so a lot of you may have heard that, microcredit has been, mentioned as changing the lives of the poor, especially changing the lives of peace in many parts of the world. But at the same time, you have another side of people who argue that microcredit is really not helping and that it's putting poor people more into debt and poverty. So how do we know who is right? When it comes to these kinds of debates, and we think that randomized controlled trial evaluations, because it builds evidence on what works using a rigorous methodology, can really help us in terms of understanding, what are the impacts of these programs. And so when you do a randomized control trial, you randomly split the population into 2 groups. You have a program group, a treatment group, as we also call them, and then a comparison group. And so we look at the outcomes for both, and that's how we measure impact. So for the microcredit studies, we did about 7 randomized evaluations around the world. I think one of which is in the Philippines. And what we did was, we used RCTs to understand the impact of these microcredit programs. And that includes splitting the population in randomly and assigning them randomly to both treatment and control, making sure that the characteristics of these 2 groups are the same, right? And so they're balanced. And the results of the study show that, while microcredit helps some businesses establish themselves, especially new businesses, it's not really the silver bullet to bring millions of people out of poverty. We don't see a lot of big changes in terms of income, and it's also on household welfare, and that was such a big result, and an issue that came out with this set of studies. In this slide, you can see that while there are no harmful effects, there are also barely any transformative impacts. And we also see that, in terms of, the studies that were conducted in many parts of the world, while business profit may have increased, business revenue, it's not the case for all of the countries that are implementing microcredit programs. And so the question now is, what's the alternative to microcredit? While microcredit it's not that transformative as we thought it would be. Maybe the question is thinking about how we should design microcredit in a way that's better in keeping with the needs of the beneficiaries or the clients, right? And maybe that's the one thing that we should be doing. We should be testing new ways of implementing microfinance and microcredit. One example also that we can take a look at is that poverty in itself is quite complex. So maybe a package of interventions would work better than just like giving one, focusing on one program. And that's what we've been also trying to test here in the Philippines. It's called a graduation of the ultra poor study. And this is really a big push program that aims to address many challenges of poverty simultaneously, including support for daily needs, as well as coaching support, health insurance, and many others. So going back to financial inclusion research, as we've seen, it can be quite complicated. When you say that there's financial access, it doesn't mean that there's financial use, right? The use of these products. And so it's very important to know that just because you're giving access, you also have to make sure that there's usage of these financial products. There's also a question of how do we accurately measure financial use? And because people use financial products in many different ways, some of them informally as well as when you're running surveys or maybe asking people on the street, there could be some recall bias. So you also have to be very careful when you do these types of research. And definitely really needing to account for diverse uses as well as heterogeneous impacts of financial inclusion. So I'll go through the evidence on financial inclusion very quickly. I know I don't have a lot of time. Usually we have more than, I think, almost an hour when we present these slides. So what I'll do is I'll just identify key themes for today. One is on financial education and second one is on digital finance. Okay. So as we know, all of you probably are quite familiar with this already. Especially on how how financial education has been implemented. The conventional way is usually in a classroom setting, in-person instruction. Oftentimes, it's catered to specific groups. There's been a wide variation in frequency, duration, and content. And the goal is that the goal is to improve financial behavior by sharing facts and concepts related to participants' financial knowledge, skills, and attitudes, right? I'll just move this. Okay. And why is it important? A lot of people think that financial education is very significant because they link financial literacy and capability as well to financial education, right? And so if you ask people, they really value financial education, especially since they think that it's the most effective way to improve access to finance among low-income borrowers. But what do we know about the effectiveness of conventional financial education? As we've seen in many of the studies that were being run is that there's really quite mixed results. So a body of evidence has been showing that the conventional approach to financial education has not been so successful, especially in giving lasting knowledge or in changing people's behavior, financial behavior. We also see that the cost seems to be very high, but there's very low demand, and oftentimes depending on the target group that's being given the financial education, you would need to sort of find a way to get them into the classroom to attend these financial education trainings. But we see that there are new directions in financial education, and I think that's the important point. Definitely, we have to go beyond the conventional way of implementing financial education. And we should look to the evidence on how to better improve running these types of programs. One, we see that there's evidence that suggests that these successful programs on financial education have one or more of the following characteristics. One, it's simple and actionable. So you give very, very concrete steps to participants, but not too complicated as well that they'll forget once they step out of the door. It also has to be personalized, right? And so you have to understand the needs as well as the environment and also the context of participants. It also has to be timely. And there have been studies around here, when people are about to make financial decisions, for example, whether it's about their pensions, it's about savings, or even credit, microcredit, you have to make sure that, the financial education program that you're running is at that point where they're, trying to make those important decisions for themselves and for their families. And fourth, it also has to be convenient and entertaining. Asking people to come to a classroom and attend these types of programs may not be as convenient for many, especially if you're a farmer or if you work in, certain sectors. Given that, you have a lot, in terms of, the issues that you're thinking about on a day-to-day basis, you also have to make sure that this is something that will grab their attention. Lastly, it's also good, to think about targeting these programs to young people, especially specifically the youth, because we've seen that there seems to be promising results, when you implement these kinds of programs for young people. So here I'm going to give you an example of a study that we did in the Dominican Republic and India, which was also implemented in the Philippines. This was in partnership with Ideas 42. And the target was micro entrepreneurs. So Ideas 42 had this program called Rules of Thumb or Heuristics Training, where they give, where they look at, very simple, actionable steps that can be shared to, micro entrepreneurs. And so they used interactive voice response. And at the same time, they looked at face-to-face orientation session and also using mobile phone-based training messages, right? And and the results were quite promising as well. And I think this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that simple and actionable steps really matter when you're implementing financial education programs. So now I'll move on to digital finance and just go through very, very quickly to some of the evidence in digital finance. Right. So as you see, that digital payments as well is very, very promising, specifically now in the Philippines in this time where a lot of people are sort of limited in terms of movement, and the government is also working with financial service providers to transfer cash payments, emergency subsidies. And I think this is quite an important aspect of financial inclusion as well. And so we see that, that digital payments can lead to cost savings, right? And this is something that a lot of us already know, especially some of the transaction costs, both for senders and receivers. It also helps with resilience, helping households smooth unexpected income shocks by providing quick access to money or support from their broader social network. We also see the link here between financial inclusion and women's empowerment, and that digital payments have been giving women greater privacy and control over resources, which can in turn promote women's economic participation and empowerment. And lastly, you see that digital products may encourage confidence and trust in financial institutions and increase account use. And this is very important in the Philippines because I'm sure most of you have already read the BSP Financial Inclusion Report that one of the barriers to getting more people into formal financial, formal finance is that there seems to be a lack of trust at some level. So here in this slide, you can see that, looking at G2P payments, right, and efficiency of government payments, we see that digital transfers reduce sender and recipient costs, they improve effectiveness, in several studies that were conducted. One example that's mentioned here is in Niger, households received cash transfers via mobile phone. They had lower travel and wait times and higher food security. At the same time, because there was ongoing conflict in the area at that time, it was also much safer for them to receive those cash transfers via mobile phone. In terms of women's empowerment, we saw that delivering cash transfers electronically increased the likelihood that the recipient was a woman was solely responsible for obtaining the transfer, and that households in which women received cash transfers were actually more resilient. They had diet diversity, and that their children were actually consuming more meals per day. In terms of poverty alleviation, we see that lowering the transaction costs as well of informal risk sharing was very important. Users of mobile money platform in Kenya that received funds for a wider network of senders, located far away, they were able to absorb large negative shocks, while non-users had to reduce consumption by 7 to 10%. So that's an important factor in resilience as well. And also in women's empowerment, similar to other cases, women with access to mobile money exercise more choice over their occupation. As I mentioned, this is really the important link between financial inclusion as well and women's empowerment, and bringing them more into business also. In terms of income, we see a significant impact as well, especially in female-headed households living in extreme poverty, as well as female-headed households living on less than on $2 a day. So we see that incomes have improved as well. In terms of labor force participation, we see that these private payments made an impact in terms of helping women think about their decision to work, and so this is a very important issue as well in terms of gender norms and labor force participation. In India, one study looked at depositing work payments into female-owned bank accounts, which led to a significant increase in both work and economic engagement, especially among women, despite prevailing gender norms. In terms of labor force participation, you see that women who received the treatment were more likely to have worked for pay in the past year and had 30% higher earnings as well. In terms of trust in financial institutions, as I mentioned, it is also quite relevant for us in the Philippines. We see that digital payments, digital finance encourage confidence and trust in financial institutions, and there's many different ways to understand that as well. In Mexico, what they did was beneficiaries of a cash transfer program use debit cards where they're able to really check their balances frequently, and as a result, they were more likely to report that they trust in the bank, right? In terms of account utilization, as reported, trust in the bank increased, savings balances increased as well. And so I think this goes hand in hand of being able to see how much you have in the bank and knowing that it's there for you, and being able to use also these financial products more frequently. So we see that evidence has been showing us that there's been benefits of digital payment, but how do we promote adoption and usage, given that in the Philippines as well, this has been an issue now that there's less take-up of digital finance and digital payments. So what do we know about promoting take-up of digital financial products? One, I think all of you are also quite aware of this already, that users are quite price sensitive, especially in terms of the transaction costs. If you put a lot of transaction costs and increase these costs, there will be people are less willing to pay for mobile money services, and also they may not actually pick up these financial products, right? And so there's a perception of that high fees really is a barrier to mobile money usage among new users, as well as looking very specifically on transaction costs. Users who live farther away from cash out agents use their accounts less. not just because they may have to pay some transaction cost with the cash agent, but also that they would have to pay for transportation costs to get to the cash out agent from wherever they are. Right? We also see that interventions to increase mobile money take-up would be quite useful. So in Bangladesh, a study found that providing trainings on how to use this product they call Bcash, which was a mobile banking service, help clients understand and use the service more. This includes sharing with them steps and protocols, giving them hands-on practice on sending transfers, facilitation of sign-up process, giving them this information as well as coaching them as well, and increase the take-up of Bcash as well in the rural control group to 70%. In Peru, the study tested the impact of trusted social networks on the adoption of mobile money. So, looking at the social networks of clients as well, it found that both lack of information and that lack of trust in the person who provides information are barriers to take up of mobile money. So, looking at digital credit this time, I'll look at two key outcomes. One is credit access and resilience. We see that the emerging evidence shows that digital credit expands credit access, but it does not substitute for other forms of finance, especially to populations who do not have access to formal finance. And second, in terms of resilience, we see that it does increase household resilience, especially when it comes to negative shocks. So as I mentioned, digital credit seems to expand, access. And I think as you are also aware, if you can access loans very quickly using your own devices, that will definitely expand, your ability to access these loans. And in Kenya, this is exactly what's happening. Access to digital loan products brought in a meaningful expansion of credit for eligible households. And that was about an 11% increase in the likelihood of these households to take out a loan. At the same time, in terms of resilience, households were less likely to forgo any expense in response to a negative shock that they're experiencing in their household. For example, negative shocks are, maybe a death in the household or someone having to need healthcare and others. Okay. In terms of consumption, there seems to be an increase in the money that they're spending for education, specifically when they have to spend on emergency and health events, and that they're able to adjust given these shocks as well in their households. So yeah, so we've seen that the digital credit has some benefits, but how about the potential risks, such as over-indebtedness and default? I think this has been a key issue as well, not just with digital credit, but also other forms of credit, such as microcredit, the traditional microcredit. And I think this is the reason why, even when we're thinking about digital credit and digital finance, we always have to be proactive about consumer protection, especially if we want to build trust in the system, in the financial system. So one study that was done in Mexico looked at loan data from a full set of approved clients. And they made the loan delivery time longer from the basic 10 hours that they usually do to 20 hours. And making that delivery time longer actually reduced to a default by 20%. So maybe this is also something to think about. Delaying loans may have provided higher returns than very quick access loans, and that borrowers were valuing the product more because they had to wait a little bit longer, I suppose. And so it's very important as well to look into this some more, using data on how they've been using digital credit and how delays affect the demand for credit. But this seems to be an interesting way of looking at how borrowers can value the product more, and and make sure that they're not just taking out loans in the spur of the moment, and really thinking about the loans that they're taking out. Okay. Another study that is quite relevant here is looking at product disclosure, and we saw that disclosing costs to consumers in a behaviorally informed way, rather than in long and difficult to understand documents, increases their comprehension and gives them really a good understanding of what they're getting into, which is also quite important. A study in Mexico and Peru found that providing the standardized key fact statement, or what they call KFS, significantly improves the ability of consumers to make financial decisions, especially with regards to credit products. And it's very effective for individuals that are financially illiterate as well. So we see that digital finance is very promising, and it's really creating opportunities to connect individuals, especially the disadvantaged, to formal financial services. Emerging evidence, as we've seen, these are just some of the examples that are being implemented in many parts of the world, and that we see that there could be a positive impact, not just on poverty alleviation, but also on economic resilience and women's empowerment. Definitely, we would need more evidence on how to increase take-up and usage, and especially in the Philippines as well. We see this as a key issue and a barrier, and that's it's very important to understand how we can optimize products and put in the regulations for consumer protection. Some of the key takeaways as well, looking at the evidence in these two key aspects of financial inclusion. One, we can't really rely on hopes and instincts to know what works. And I think this is really a key message here, especially as all of you are working on your projects. And that, just because, we have an instinct that something's going to work, we don't really know whether it's going to work until we test what we're doing. That's very, very important. For IPA, what we do is that we really want to make sure that there's partnerships between researchers, the private sector, government, NGOs, especially in answering these questions in real time. So this is really something that would be answered with a variety of stakeholders as well. We also see that there's still a lot of questions that remain, and that we need to build more evidence and implement more rigorous studies, especially in optimizing products, learning, thinking about how we can increase take-up and usage, having a human-centered design. I think that's a very important aspect as well, especially if we're looking at a certain segment of the population, and if you're thinking about expanding financial inclusion to a certain segment, we really have to think about the design of these financial products as well. Especially, for example, if you're targeting, the ultra poor, some savings may not be top of mind. And so if you're thinking about a savings product, you have to really think about it from the perspective of someone in that situation as well. We also have to think about, looking at the gender appropriate design, especially since there seems to be very important links between financial inclusion and women's empowerment as well. There's a lot of questions on the impact of finance on other development goals, such as climate resilience, food, education, and others. Lastly, consumer protection issues are also very important, and that is very critical to address these early on when we're thinking about financial products. And lastly, there's it's not one size fits all. No, one size does not fit all when it comes to financial inclusion. So it's very important to understand the population that you're trying to work with, and making sure that you're designing these products appropriately as well. Okay. So I think that ends my presentation for now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nash. So for the Q&A part, we'll do it at the end
Okay.
in our during the open forum. But thank you very much for keying on financial education and digital finance